Do you ever miss those forgotten meals? The ones so good, it's hard to believe we left them behind. In the 80s, these everyday dishes filled lunchboxes and weeknight tables with flavors that defined growing up. What if we didn't just forget them, but something more? Who doesn't love the aroma of a good homemade casserole? Well, this hearty meal was still winning hearts even during the Dust Bowl days. Now, during the Dust Bowl, casseroles weren't the fancy, cheesy concoctions we know today. They were more like a hodgepodge of whatever was on hand. Leftover vegetables, some mystery meat, maybe some canned beans, all thrown together in a baking dish. Not exactly Instagram-worthy, but it was a way to use up scraps and fill up the dining table. Plus, they were the stars of potlucks and holiday dinners. This was the era of coming up with all different recipes for casseroles and everything from hash brown casseroles to tuna noodle casseroles. These recipes were passed down from generation to generation and made their way to us. Casseroles were the kind of dish that brought people together, not just because they were filling, but because they were often made with love and shared with family and friends. They were a reminder that even in the hardest of times, people found ways to come together and enjoy a meal. So lasagna soup is really as Italian as it gets. It was one of the most common recipes to make when people were coming out of the Depression, because it was extremely comforting and warm. It involved basically the entire blueprint of a lasagna, the pasta, meat, and vegetables, and yes, the unholy amounts of tomato sauce, but it was all in soup form. This dish was something people really treasured both for its taste and how easy it became to prepare it thanks to modern progressions in cooking appliances. You didn't have slow cookers that were half this good back in the 50s and 60s. One of the best reasons to make this dish was that it offered you a lot of nutrition for almost nothing. You could make this using leftovers, random scraps, or even vegetables that are different from what you typically order. This helps keep the soup fresh each time you make it, while also ensuring that it becomes your go-to for a health boost. Who wouldn't want that? Personally, I think the Italians really cracked the code on all this healthy eating stuff. What about you? Would you consider keeping lasagna soup as a side dish in your roster? Or are you a purist who swears there's nothing better than the classic layered, cheesy lasagna? Now, fermented foods like kimchi and sauerkraut, as well as miso, had started out as these really innovative and practical solutions to help preserve food before refrigeration had become such a household concept. But once they had begun to be associated with a lot of poor communities and rural ones, they started to be shunned away. Before refrigeration, fermentation was a pretty necessary way to help store food for the winters in all sorts of countries, not just America. It was more or less the staple way to preserve things for a lot of rural communities and farmsteads. Fermented foods were overlooked in more urban areas because of the harsh scents and the peasant-like feel of it, but that was really just people being snobby. They've got the opposite image now. I mean, haven't you seen all those viral TikToks about homegrown fermented kimchi? Lots of modern science also backs up the various health benefits of fermented foods. Who knows? Maybe it's what you need too. When ovens weren't available, desserts had to be made another way. That's how settlers, sailors, and struggling families ended up steaming their sweets instead of baking them. Slump or Grunt was an old-fashioned dessert that took whatever fruit was on hand, fresh, dried, or even canned, and turned it into something warm and comforting without the need for an oven. This dish had deep roots in early American cooking, especially in New England, where wild berries were plentiful. The process was simple. Fruit was simmered with sugar in a pot, and instead of a crust, a soft dumpling-like dough was spooned on top. As it cooked, the dough steamed and puffed up, soaking in the juices. Some regions called it slump because the dough collapsed slightly as it settled. Others called it grunt because of the bubbling sound it made while cooking. The best part? It didn't require fancy ingredients. Flour, sugar, and whatever fruit was available, nothing went to waste. If berries were too expensive, apples, pears, or even rhubarb worked just as well. For those who grew up with it, slump or grunt wasn't just dessert. It was a reminder of how families made do with what they had, proving that even in hard times, a little sweetness could still be found. Among the meals that fueled armies across Northern Europe, few were as humble and essential as porridge. Whether made from oats, barley, or a mix of both, this hearty dish was a staple in the Scottish Highlands and across many northern European forces. Easy to prepare, filling, and rich in nutrients, porridge was a soldier's reliable companion, especially in colder climates where extra calories were crucial for maintaining energy. Soldiers were often given a basic porridge made from oats and barley, both of which were cheap and durable. The simplicity of the dish didn't stop there. Flavoring was minimal, often just a sprinkle of salt. However, on rare occasions, dried fruits like raisins or berries might be thrown in for a touch of sweetness, a welcome surprise in an otherwise bland meal. But the real beauty of porridge was its versatility. Whether served thick and dense or thinner, it could be adapted to whatever was available. The grains were easy to store and transport, and the dish could be cooked over a fire without requiring much effort. When times were tough, oats and barley provided soldiers with the carbohydrates and fiber they needed to power through long, exhausting days on the march. Collard greens have been a peasant food for many reasons and for a long time. They were really popular in African American culture for sharecroppers, small farmsteads, rural villages, and more. A lot of people relied on them for centuries, but their reputation was always that of low-class food. Towards the 20th century, collard greens began to gain some respect as a symbol of the South and its humble, rustic cuisine. Now, what I like to think is that this dish was in the right place at the right time. See, towards the end of the 20th century, there was a massive health scare going around all of America, particularly the South. What can I say? Years of drippings, bacon, lard, fat, and deep frying things in oil or beer or both may do that to you. Collard greens began a light that people were flocking to, full moth style. People were familiar enough with them, had an acquired taste for them too, and liked all the different spins you could throw on the dish. So for a lot of people, they were the first step towards a healthier lifestyle. And that's really why they did a complete 180. Despite the prices of white sugar dropping as a whole after the First World War, leading molasses to decline in popularity, they made a strong comeback as the engine fueled a great batch of molasses cookies. People also started abandoning white sugar during the Second World War, and it caused them to look for alternatives for their yearly Christmas baking sessions, and the government was already pushing on molasses for widespread public use pretty hard. Eventually, people saw the value, and the ones that did not have to, because it was so much cheaper to get molasses than any other ingredient. That, along with some sorghum syrup, meant that people could still enjoy a fresh batch of hot cookies and warm milk to welcome the winter. It might not seem like much, but maintaining tiny traditions like that meant a lot to people and kept their spirits going as the days got harder and costlier. Speaking of molasses, they also went really great with some slow-baked beans. Molasses have a knack for adding a lot of deep flavor to a dish, and the fact that these were usually left overnight to absorb all of it made for probably the best baked beans people could get in those times. It was especially popular as a summertime meal. Baked beans were not too hard to get, not the tinned versions because those were still pricey. Once you had some, you would just leave them in water to soften, and then the beans would be baked for 8 hours straight overnight. Making it was a whole day, literally. But once you were done with the prep work, it was all just a waiting game. And this was one time where being patient really paid off. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. Powdered milk was there to step in when fresh milk wasn't an option. Powdered milk was a marvel of food science, transforming surplus dairy into a shelf-stable product that didn't require refrigeration. a crucial feature for families without electric iceboxes during the Great Depression. Technically, a few scoops of powder whisked into the water made a liquid that resembled milk. The taste was more chalky than creamy, and the fresh stuff had a richer flavor. But powdered milk wasn't about luxury. It was about survival. It was a base for soups, sauces, and baked goods, making it one of the most versatile Depression-era pantry items. Families with children found powdered milk especially important because it meant kids got a steady supply of calcium and protein, even when fresh dairy was not available. It was also affordable, which meant it became a favorite among relief programs, which distributed it to struggling households. Powdered milk was a lifeline for families living far from the nearest dairy farm in rural areas where refrigeration was scarce. Today, powdered milk is used mostly for emergencies and backpacking trips, but it played a big role during the Great Depression. It was a symbol of ingenuity and resilience, taking something as simple as milk and turning it into a survival tool in a world of scarce resources. Life on the march wasn't glamorous, and neither was the food, but it was dependable. Pottage was the workhorse of pre-modern diets, a thick, hearty stew made from whatever grains, legumes, and vegetables were on hand. Think of it as the ultimate clean-out-the-pantry recipe, centuries before that was trendy. It was survival in a pot. Soldiers would boil ingredients together, letting them simmer for hours over a fire. Barley, peas, lentils, onions, whatever was in season or could last on the road made it in. And if you were lucky enough to have access to bread, it became the perfect accompaniment to soak up every last drop. Pottage was endlessly customizable. In lean times, it might be just barley and water. During rare moments of abundance, soldiers might toss in some herbs, bones, or even a bit of meat, transforming it into a feast. Medieval armies didn't have Michelin stars, but they did know how to stretch a meal. Of course, it wasn't always exciting. It was the same flavor, day after day. Still, when you're cold, hungry, and far from home, a bowl of pottage could taste better than gold. After all, the real luxury was staying alive and staying warm. Potatoes had more use than just what was under all the layers. Once peeled, people would often fry the potato skins as a midday snack. Nothing would ever go to waste in homes back then, as you must have gathered by now. If they can make stuff out of sausage drippings and drain the fat from bacon to reuse, frying up some potato skins does not seem that out of the box at all. These fried skins were the perfect sidekick to potato pancakes, and the fact that the skins had a lot of health benefits made it all the more appealing. Things like this really helped to keep appetites in check, and that meant that the financial situation of the home would be calmer too. When a meal needed to be stretched as far as possible, soup was often the answer. Cabbage and dough soup was one of the simplest ways to turn a few humble ingredients into something warm, filling, and, on good days, almost satisfying. Cabbage was a Depression-era staple. It was cheap, hearty, and lasted longer than most vegetables. It didn't take much to turn it into soup, just water, salt, and maybe a bit of lard if it was available. But what made this dish unique was the dough. Instead of noodles or potatoes, families made quick, flour-based dumplings. A simple mix of flour and water, sometimes with a pinch of salt, was shaped into lumps and dropped into the boiling broth. The dough swelled as it cooked, making the pot seem fuller and the meal feel more substantial. Many immigrant families, particularly in Eastern Europe, had their own versions of this dish long before the Great Depression. But in America, it became a go-to meal when there was little else. For those who remember eating it, cabbage and dough soup was about getting through another day. It was a reminder that even when ingredients were scarce, a pot of boiling water and a little creativity could still feed a family. A hot meal didn't always mean something fresh from the stove. Sometimes it was as simple as a bowl, a handful of crackers, and some milk. Cracker and milk soup was one of the humblest dishes of the Depression era, basic, filling, and made with ingredients that lasted. Saltine crackers were cheap, widely available, and often handed out at relief centers. Families kept them on hand because they didn't spoil quickly, making them a reliable pantry staple. When bread was too expensive or hard to come by, crackers became the substitute. Some people crumbled them into a bowl and poured cold milk over them. Others warmed the milk first to make it feel more like a proper soup. If sugar was available, a sprinkle might be added for sweetness. If times were harder, water replaced the milk, turning it into an even more stripped-down version. This wasn't gourmet dining. It was about getting something in your stomach when options were limited. But for those who grew up eating it, cracker and milk soup was a reminder of the sacrifices families made, the resilience they showed, and the meals that carried them through. In the toughest of times, even something as simple as crackers and milk could feel like comfort. During the Great Depression, breakfast wasn't always bacon and eggs. Sometimes it was just a cup of weak coffee poured over stale bread. Depression-era coffee soup was a resourceful way to stretch both food and money, because when every penny counted, nothing was wasted. Coffee was cheap, especially if it was brewed weak and reused multiple times. Families would stretch a single pot for days, reheating it and adding water until it barely resembled coffee at all. When milk or cream was too expensive, this warm, slightly bitter broth was used to soften day-old bread or crackers, transforming them into an improvised meal. Some families added a sprinkle of sugar if they had it, while others used a dab of butter for extra richness. It was a survival meal, but it also carried cultural weight. French and Scandinavian immigrants had their own versions, sometimes called soupe au café or café soupe. What was once a traditional breakfast drink in Europe became a necessity in America when money ran out. The brilliance of this dish wasn't in its complexity, but in its ability to make something out of nothing. Chow is a pretty decent little dip in the southern side of America. Appalachian regions really just can't get enough of the stuff, and they definitely never fell out of the habit of pairing it up with most of their dishes. You could call it a pickled relish, but it's really just this dip made out of a cocktail of different greens and spices. You got your peppers, mustard seeds, cinnamon, and cloves, as well as cabbage, green tomatoes, and onions. It's actually a lot sweeter than you would originally think too, and really crunchy. People would chop the vegetables as finely as they could and mix them with vinegar, sugar, and spices to make this really vibrant brine, which stood out among other flavors at the time during the 20th century. The vegetables were also blanched and then placed in jars. The brine was then poured over them, and this would be sealed in jars so that it could marinate. It sounds simple enough, but it's a bit tricky, and even taking a bit of time away or leaving it in there for just a tad bit too long can mess with the flavors here. Let's stay in the South for a while. It's not all savory and spicy, they even have some great desserts. Speaking of food combinations, this next one will definitely blow your mind. Have you ever thought of combining beef with gelatin? If not, this is your sign to twist things up a bit and try this one out. There's a reason why this one was the talk of the town during the dirty 30s. The gelatin was used to thicken soups and stews, while the beef added a hint of protein. Now, since the supply was always limited, don't expect a whole beef steak in your bowl. Just a few chopped up bits and pieces of meat and every few bites was all you got. This meal was designed to be full, and it was left bland for the most part. However, some people in the South decided to spice things up a bit by remixing the recipe according to their likes. One such recipe included canned corned beef, canned peas, gelatin, lemon juice, and vinegar. We wouldn't consider pairing these ingredients today, but it was a lifesaver for those who had to make it through the hard times. If you go over to the village of Finan in Scotland, you'll find Finan Haddie, which in America is a euphoric Scotty banger. Give the room 2 minutes, and if everyone isn't seated, settled, and forked up in about 2 minutes max, I'll hand you a cash prize. If you want to get really authentic and traditional, you cook the smoked haddock over an open fire on a wooden stove. Really though, there were all kinds of ways of cooking Finan Haddie. People would bake it, steam it, boil it, and do all kinds of other things. It's one of the most popular fish dishes in America for a pretty good reason though, and it's the same reason corn oysters got so popular. There are lots of coastal cities in America, and the fishing industry is thriving and bustling. Especially throughout the 1980s, it was really common for people to just live off of the catches of the day and whatever you'd find swimming upstream in the river. Unfortunately, though, it pretty much existed as this rural, regional specialty in coastal areas. Finan Haddie was usually made with a lot of cream, fat, and butter, which meant that it wasn't going to last with all the healthy eating trends that were taking over. People ended up forgetting it, and outside of some traditional Scottish communities, no one even really knows about this dish. You can't call it vintage since it wasn't that long ago, which makes its immense fall-off even more surprising. When a meal needed to be stretched, dumplings were a go-to solution. But when flour was scarce and meat was expensive, families had to get creative. That's how Bologna and cornbread dumplings found their way to the dinner table, a dish that took two cheap ingredients and turned them into something hearty. Cornmeal was an affordable staple, especially in the South where cornbread was already a common dish. Instead of traditional dumplings made with flour, families mixed cornmeal with water or milk to form a dough. Chunks of Bologna, one of the cheapest meats available, were folded in, adding a little protein and salty flavor. The dumplings were then dropped into boiling water or broth, cooking up into a soft, filling meal. This dish was pure ingenuity. Bologna was one of the most budget-friendly meats of the time, and cornbread was a familiar way to stretch a meal. Together, they created a dumpling that was easy to make, filling, and, at least in tough times, satisfying. Bologna and cornbread dumplings were about making something from nothing, using the simplest ingredients to create a meal that filled stomachs and carried families through the hardest days. When there was nothing, beaten biscuits are typically an American-only concept. They refer to physically pounding the dough with some kind of mallet or rolling pin and then really working that batter over, like as hard as you possibly can. This basically gives it an almost rubber band-like texture with how elastic it becomes, and that makes it really different from your typical biscuit dough. See, that one can barely hold itself together, but this one functions as a whole individual unit. It has all your typical ingredients too, and it's honestly a little cheaper overall since it uses all-purpose flour. In the South and in Appalachian homes, it was pretty common for colonial middle-class homes to make this as a snack or even as a breakfast item. It took way more effort than it was worth, though. Women had to beat the dough for hours and hours until it was ready. Sourdough actually has been through the ringer a few times, so it started out being the preferred bread, but it went through a decline over the 1900s thanks to industrialized bread and commercial yeast taking over. Fast-acting yeast was so accessible, and it meant that not only was bread making a lot easier and a lot quicker thanks to this, but that wasn't all. One of the biggest benefits of industrialized bread making was that they got the formula on lock. With sourdough, you had like 7 loaves out of 10 on a good day that would be sellable. With industrialized baking, all of them were ready to be sat on a shelf. Now, the artisans wouldn't really take this just laying down, right? No, they decide if the opponent is doubling down, so will they. They brought back artisan baking in the 1980s and 1990s with a really creative spin that was focusing on how artisan bread is rustic, personalized, authentic, and how you can get a bread experience you will never find on the shelves of any store in America. San Francisco was one of the hubs for this boom. They had a place called Boudin there that became famous for bringing back San Francisco-style sourdough. They successfully rebranded it as this artistic bread that's for real lovers, and that drew a lot of people back in, rich and otherwise. Potato pancakes are one that we are very sad to have seen fade away from the arsenal of home chefs. Pancakes made with matzo or applesauce topped with garlic or fried onions made for such a mouth-watering meal. Low-income households back in those times were struggling to buy produce. Farmers' markets were uniformly unaffordable for middle-income households due to creeping inflation. People needed a vegetable that was cost-appropriate and easy to make in batches. Enter the potato pancake, which revolutionized the breakfast scene in a struggling time. As times improved, people slowly started going to more fancier and creative breakfasts, unfortunately leaving simpler dishes behind. Potato pancakes took a backseat in the face of changing food and economic trends, but anyone from the era will rave to you about the godsend these were. Split pea soup was always something that we enjoyed greatly, mostly thanks to our European neighbors in the States. They didn't become a nationwide sensation until the Depression and World War II hit, though. That entire period actually saw an insane spike in the general perception of beans, peas, and lentils. Basically, anything that was vaguely similar to that was suddenly God's greatest gift to Earth. this doesn't just have to do with the times being hard and there being a massive war going on either. It has to do, again, with some age-old state-backed peer pressure. A lot of people were lost in the face of rations and surpluses that just didn't make the cut or last very long. The tensions with the government were extraordinarily high, especially with a lot of people just being tired of the war effort. The government of the United States of America decided to encourage people to cultivate some new hobbies in these trying times. One of those happens to be foraging, and it was just as convenient as it sounds. Free food that you can gather right from nature itself, that no one has to pay for? You can definitely see why something like that went mainstream. In the chaos of ancient and medieval warfare, time was a luxury, and so was leavened bread. When soldiers needed sustenance on the go, they turned to flatbread, a simple yet effective solution. Made from flour and water, sometimes with a pinch of salt, it required no rising time and could be baked on a flat stone or a metal plate over an open fire. Flatbread was a culinary bridge between cultures. From the Roman legions to medieval Arab armies, its versatility made it a universal staple. Soldiers could eat it plain, use it to scoop up stew, or even wrap it around dried meat for an early version of the sandwich. And unlike leavened bread, flatbread was far more forgiving. It could survive days of travel without becoming a crumbly mess. It wasn't all perfection, though. Cooking over a fire meant the bread could be scorched in seconds if you weren't careful. More than a few soldiers probably had to settle for extra crispy flatbread when they got distracted by a battle horn. Still, this simple, adaptable bread earned its reputation as a battlefield favorite. Beef barley soup is but a humble dish that comes right from tales of peasant wives making hearty breakfasts for their families. Sorry for sounding like a Lord of the Rings extra for a second. Really though, beef barley soup is as vintage as a recipe can get. Barley itself is one of the most ancient grains we have, not just in the States, but all across the world. Again, the idea of pairing it with beef is something we took from our European buddies that immigrated to Uncle Sam's greener pastures. When they weren't looking so green, and trust me, the 1930s and 40s were a long time, it was in everyone's mutual interest to play it smart. By that I mean there was a lot of inspiration to take from all the different communities around in the States. What is America if not a melting pot of different cultures? Beef barley soup used a lot less meat than the recipe typically calls for, but the substitute of roasted vegetables really brought it all together in a wonderful way. It was now not just a peasant dish for field workers, but something everyone had daily, because it was the best they could get. As far as names go, this is probably the most insulting one I've ever seen. But nonetheless, a garbage plate is a Rochester classic, and if you're ever in New York, you'd be doing yourself a disservice by not trying it. Yes, you heard me right, a garbage plate. Not following? I wouldn't blame you. If someone told me to eat that, I'd probably think they were making fun of me. In reality, though, a garbage plate is pretty much just this massive behemoth-sized platter that you can really customize and adjust however you would like. Pasta fan? Throw in some macaroni and homemade fries. Meathead? You can't ever have enough ham, sausages, and chicken. Vegetable addict? Works for everyone. Still, who came up with such a massive display of gluttony? Nick Tahu Hots, which used to be one of the top restaurants in New York in 1918, founded by Nick Tahu, apparently made the dish for the first time. It was his way of giving customers the most bang for their buck and giving them a big meal for an affordable price. Quickly, it became a quintessential part of New York's street food culture and a symbol of the kind of indulgence you'd only find in the streets of New York City. The name itself apparently comes from how it looks, which, well, isn't really flattering. Offal had almost a one-to-one copy of bone marrow's experience. It was offal that was considered peasant food since way before any of our recent centuries, like this thing goes as far back as sardines do. Organ meats have never really been popular in any part of America, historically speaking, not until recently. But how did we get here? Well, a lot of chefs had a hand in helping people be more open to the benefits of nose-to-tail eating. If you aren't familiar with the term, it just means to not waste any part of the animal, from the nose right down to the tail. They wouldn't just serve it up in a gamey, metallic-tasting stew, though. They'd give proper recipes with sides and dips accompanying the offal dish, bringing out the best in. Plus, Besides just high-end restaurants and an appreciation for different kinds of food growing among the American people, it kind of got popular with the foodies. Lots of high-end restaurants started using liver mousses, braised hearts, or roasted bone marrow in their dishes. It's a whole thing. BBQ Spaghetti is a Memphis, Tennessee classic, and it takes the best of both worlds. You have barbecue, which is something that Memphis swore long ago that it couldn't live without, and you have spaghetti. Memphis-style barbecue works extremely well with spaghetti because it has a big focus on the smoky and tangy side of things. This barbecue uses a sauce that's made out of marinara and a tomato-based barbecue sauce too, which is a big part of what gives it that smoky flavor. Then, you have your pulled pork and chicken, along with some classics like bell peppers and garlic, which give the dish its finishing touches as far as flavor is concerned. Despite its status as a regional classic, this is really just a new dish that only recently made its name in the Memphis food scene. It wasn't always there, but what was a big and ancient part of Memphis tradition is barbecuing. You could just consider this another successful experiment in that long-lasting tradition. It's originally believed that African American communities came up with barbecue spaghetti, and it was probably a way to get rid of leftover meat. Since there probably wasn't enough to constitute a full plate, people would often mix it with any kind of grain or starch to get a full meal. Vinegar pie is the rather odd dish on this list that proves that at times of desperation, anyone will eat anything. Vinegar pie started spreading infectiously out of states like Pennsylvania in the start of the 1930s and tops even dandelion salad when it comes to being budget-friendly. All you would need is an open crust, vinegar, sugar, and some eggs to create this unique pie. To cover the mediocre taste, people would coat the crust with a meringue. It was an affectionate treat to bring in case of a celebration and was easy to make if you had a sweet craving. The dish was also pretty delicious if you were able to get over the sour vinegar taste and focus on the meringue. People really wanted a sweet treat at the end of a hard week spent cutting corners and working long hours, and small joys like vinegar pies were what kept people sustained. Are you a big fan of deli food? Deli meats, sandwiches, loaves, that kind of thing? Then one of the best parts of that kind of eating was the olive loaf. It was usually made with pork and beef plus chopped green olives, which is what it became known for. There was a small, brief period before convenience foods started taking over America, where processed meats were really becoming a thing, and this dish was a big part of that time, which arguably spanned all over the 1940s to the 1970s. It had an extremely loyal fan base too, as this was responsible for many deli counters still staying in business. These days, you could find retro stalls that still do a mean olive load, but the days where this was a commonplace item on the street and something you'd see your grandma cooking up are long gone in America's history. People definitely remember the flavors of the Bologna, the ham loaves, and all the amazing dips they came with, though. Pepperoni Rolls are actually a pretty iconic and beloved snack if you go on over to West Virginia. A lot of people think that this has to do with how the snack has its roots deep in the Italian immigrant communities that have settled down there and made a home throughout the 20th century, but I also think it's this general trend of Americans preferring Italian and French food. A lot of miners would eat these rolls, though, especially in the towns that were really known for mining. Pepperoni rolls remained popular through the 1980s, especially as a budget-friendly meal option during economic downturns. Their portability made them a go-to for busy families and workers looking for quick, affordable lunches. Unlike pricier deli meats or elaborate sandwiches, pepperoni rolls offered a satisfying blend of protein, carbs, and flavor at a low cost. Plus, their shelf stability meant they could be packed ahead of time for school lunches, road trips, or shift work. The rolls were made out of your typical pastry dough and stuffed to the brim with cheese and pepperoni, and they became a staple of all kinds of local bakeries. You could even find to-go versions for sale in convenience stores, and if you wanted rolls that looked fancier, then you'd go for the ones served at restaurants. For centuries, armies on the move relied on foods that were as tough as the soldiers themselves. Dried beans and lentils were real tiny powerhouses of nutrition that were easy to carry, nearly impossible to spoil, and packed with protein and calories. With a little water and patience, these humble legumes could transform into a hearty meal capable of sustaining entire armies. They were very economical. A single sack of lentils could feed dozens, making them a staple in ancient armies like the Romans and the Greeks. Lentils were so integral to the Roman diet that some historians called them the soldier's caviar, though that might have been more wishful thinking than reality. Cooking them, however, wasn't always straightforward. Soldiers often had to soak them overnight, a luxury they didn't always have during marches or battles. This meant the occasional crunchy surprise when time ran out. Despite their simplicity, beans and lentils had one undeniable perk. They could adapt to almost any flavor. Whether cooked in a broth with onions and herbs or simply boiled with a pinch of salt, they delivered the nourishment soldiers needed to keep fighting. And while no one was writing poetry about legumes, one thing was certain: these little guys pulled their weight. When protein was hard to come by, people got creative with what they had. Peanut butter soup was a Depression-era meal that turned a pantry staple into a warm, filling dish that kept hunger at bay. Peanut butter was cheap, packed with protein, and didn't spoil easily, making it a lifesaver for struggling families. Instead of spreading it thin on bread, some turned it into soup. The method was simple. Peanut butter was mixed with water or milk and heated until it became a creamy, slightly nutty broth. Some added sugar for a sweeter version, while others used salt and onions to create something more savory. This dish wasn't just a product of tough times. Variations of peanut-based soups existed long before the Great Depression, especially in African and Asian cuisines. But in America, it became a way to stretch a single jar of peanut butter further than sandwiches ever could. It may not have been a culinary masterpiece, but peanut butter soup did what it needed to: provide warmth, nutrition, and just enough comfort to make a tough day a little easier. For those who ate it, the memory stuck. Not for its taste, but for what it represented, making do with whatever was on hand and turning the simplest ingredients into survival. The pork belly we've come to know is stuff like hong shao roo and Korean grilled pork belly, which is pretty melt in your mouth and really delicious. It's funny to think this same thing used to be peasant food in not just the United States, but all the home countries of the dishes I just mentioned. It was a pretty scrappy cut, but it turned into a fine dining dish thanks to innovative techniques in preparing it, and lots of slow roasting and braising. Remember, there's nothing a good slow roast can't fix when you're dealing with a tough cut of meat that people usually don't work with. If you're really looking to get fancy with it, you can start to crisp the pork belly, and that really turns into a feast. Pork belly isn't the cheap scrap it's always been considered up until today. It's one thing that's actually a common sight on lots of fine dining menus across places like Vegas or Los Angeles even. For soldiers on the march, portability was everything, and few foods were as reliable as bread and cheese. Roman legionnaires famously carried flat loaves of bread and wedges of hard cheese, often made from sheep or goat's milk. The combination was a nutritional powerhouse: carbs for energy and protein for strength, all in a package that could survive the harsh conditions of a campaign. But let's not romanticize it. The bread was often dense and tough, more akin to a brick than a baguette. Soldiers sometimes had to soak it in water or wine just to make it chewable. The cheese wasn't the creamy delight you'd find at a deli. Aged for durability, it leaned more toward rock hard than velvety soft. Still, when paired together, they made a meal that was surprisingly satisfying and, most importantly, long-lasting. In medieval times, knights and foot soldiers kept the tradition alive, carrying wheels of cheese and hearty loaves during long marches. Back then, breaking bread wasn't just a saying, it was a literal act of survival. Sure, it wasn't gourmet, but when the choice is between stale bread and hunger, even a Roman would tell you, the bread wins every time. Lettuce past its prime wasn't something to throw away, it was something to transform. Wilted lettuce salad was a clever way to make the most of garden greens that had started to droop, and it turned an almost wasted ingredient into a dish with real flavor. This wasn't a crisp, refreshing salad, it was something entirely different. Instead of tossing out wilted lettuce, families salvaged it by dressing it up with a warm, tangy bacon grease dressing. The hot grease, often mixed with vinegar, sugar, and a pinch of salt, would slightly cook the lettuce, giving it a soft, savory bite. Sometimes onions or hard-boiled eggs were added if they were available. The practice of making wilted salads wasn't new. It had deep roots in Southern and Appalachian kitchens, where nothing went to waste. During tough times, people had to be resourceful, and using every bit of homegrown produce was essential. Lettuce might have been too delicate to last long without refrigeration, but with a little ingenuity, even the droopiest leaves had a second life. Wilted lettuce salad was a reminder of the era's mindset. Waste nothing, use everything. It was about stretching ingredients, finding comfort in simplicity, and proving that even tired lettuce could still have its moment on the table. When flour was a luxury and wheat was scarce, people turned to what they had: cornmeal. That's how corn dodgers became a staple in struggling households across rural America. Corn had long been the backbone of Southern and frontier cooking, but during the Great Depression, it became even more essential. Cornmeal was cheap, widely available, and didn't require the refrigeration that more expensive ingredients did. Mixing it with water, salt, and sometimes a bit of fat or milk, families shaped the batter into small cakes and either fried them in a pan or baked them on a hot stone. The result? A crispy, golden bite of sustenance that could be eaten plain, dipped in water, or, on good days, smothered in gravy. The ingenuity behind corn dodgers lay in their versatility. They could replace bread, be carried on long journeys without spoiling, and even serve as a side dish to stretch a meager meal. Cowboys and pioneers ate them, and so did struggling families in the 1930s. For many, the taste of corn dodgers is a reminder of resilience, a symbol of making do when options were limited. A handful of cornmeal, a little heat, and a lot of determination were all it took. Cheese and potatoes are like a match made in heaven, and Grandma's cheesy, scalloped potatoes was straight out of any cheese lover's dream. So this casserole tastes even better than it looked, and let me tell you, it looked finger-licking delicious. The term scalloped comes from the French word escalope, which originally referred to thin slices of meat. However, in the case of scalloped potatoes, it refers to the thinly sliced potatoes used in the dish. Many grandmas used old-fashioned methods to make their cheesy scalloped potatoes, including hand-slicing the potatoes thinly, layering them with love, and cooking them slowly. Some even added secret ingredients they swear by, like a dash of nutmeg, a hint of garlic, or even a sprinkle of paprika for added flavor. The best part about this one was its crispy crust, and I'm sure you remember fighting all your siblings for the bigger chunk of it. This dish wasn't only tasty, but was also practical. It was a one-pot wonder, meaning it could be cooked and served in the same dish, making cleanup a breeze. I'm sure Grandma loved. Preserving food was a matter of survival, and for soldiers on the move, smoked meat was more than a meal. It was a lifeline. Long before refrigeration, smoke was nature's preservative, infusing meat with flavor while keeping bacteria at bay. Unlike salted meat, which could be tough and overwhelmingly briny, smoked venison, beef, or even pork offered a more palatable and aromatic option. The process wasn't quick. Smoking meat required hours, sometimes days, over low, consistent heat, with wood types carefully chosen for their flavor. Hickory, oak, and applewood were integral to the preservation process. Once smoked, the meat could last for weeks or even months, making it ideal for soldiers who had to carry their food supply on their backs. This preservation method wasn't without its quirks. Smokehouses where the magic happened became a common sight near military camps. They were so important that losing one to fire or sabotage could cripple an army's food reserves. Of course, the soldiers weren't exactly gourmands. A joke went that smoked meat was great for keeping your teeth in shape, if you could chew through it. But on a cold night, after a long march, a strip of smoked beef paired with bread or pottage was as close to comfort food as a soldier could get. Pancakes and cutlets were not the only comfort cooking people made out of the vegetable we just talked about because it is oh so resourceful. Potato soup was also a regular item at the top of the menu. People would usually use whatever basic vegetables they had to make the soup more varied, but even potatoes, some grounded black pepper and water went fine. Typically, though, people would barter for a few onions or carrots to spice the soup up for special occasions or when it had been a while since they had their last good bowl of hot soup. Especially in the winters, when people needed nutrition more than ever. In about 25 minutes, you had yourself a quality and healthy meal that kept your energy going for all the labor of the week. I'm going to have to go back to talking about how much we've borrowed from our British friends over in the United Kingdom. Bubble and squeak is quintessential British food after all. It was pretty genius too. This shares a theme with the picnic casseroles we just discussed because both were phenomenal ways to repurpose your leftovers. A lot of these dishes were powerhouses made exclusively out of stuff that was either left behind or simply was about to go bad. The earliest mention of bubble and squeak is in the 1700s, and that's just a pretty bare-bones meat and cabbage dish. Over time, it was adapted to the current situation, and meatless versions were made popular. These ones just prioritized using potatoes and vegetables, basically anything high in fiber. The reason you'd want that is because it'd keep you full for longer, which was always a godsend during the war. The potatoes would work as a binding agent. The leftover vegetables were chopped and mixed in for nutrition, and if you got super lucky, some corned beef or bacon would work really well for flavor. As far as the culture goes, bubble and squeak really emphasize the mentality of wasting absolutely nothing. Despite how humble the recipe is, it's definitely something that brought comfort to a lot of families. War or no war, who can say some mashed potatoes and greens haven't cheered them up at some point? For a generation that lived through the Depression, saltine crackers were Depression-era superheroes in disguise as mere squares of humdrum dough. Saltines stretched scarce ingredients further, providing the fill-in-the-gaps when bread, flour, or even meat ran short. Break them into milk for breakfast? Done. Canned goods? Layer them with them for a makeshift casserole? Absolutely. A rare treat. Toast them with cheese? Heaven on a plate. Saltines were cheap, long-lasting, and endlessly useful, so families stockpiled them. Because they were shelf-stable, they stayed fresh for months, a game-changer when grocery trips were out of the question. Saltines were also a change in texture and flavor from food that got monotonous, which was often the case during the Depression. They were neutral, so whatever was on hand could be put on them. Peanut butter, jelly, or leftover gravy. Today, they're often overshadowed by their fancier cracker cousins, but saltines still have a nostalgic charm. In the 1930s, they were more than a snack. They were a survival tool, and sometimes the simplest things were the biggest things. During long military campaigns, soldiers needed food that could withstand the rigors of travel, storage, and time. Salt pork and beans, a combination that became a military staple, particularly during the colonial and Napoleonic Wars. Salt pork was the go-to protein for soldiers because it could be stored for months without refrigeration. The pork was heavily salted to preserve it, a method that also gave it a distinctive, sometimes overpowering flavor. Soldiers learned to love, or at least tolerate, the salty taste, especially when paired with the hearty goodness of beans. Beans, often the dried variety, were another long-lasting and easy-to-prepare food source. When combined with salt pork, they formed a simple, calorie-dense meal that could be boiled up over a campfire. Whether cooked with a little extra fat or simply simmered in water, this dish provided the soldiers with both protein and the energy to endure grueling days on the march. Of course, the meal was hardly a gourmet affair. In fact, some soldiers were less than thrilled by the monotony of it. As any soldier might tell you, when it comes to survival food, variety takes a backseat to reliability. Salt pork and beans delivered just that, reliable sustenance no matter the season or the conditions. Chitlins have a longer history than you might think. They were originally a survival food for poor people, right? Especially in the American South. Now it's exactly those roots that tied it so strongly to its community. People had been relying on this for years, and they had honestly come to be too familiar with it, especially in African American communities. In West Africa even, you have lots of dishes that involve offal meat. But chitlins weren't out of their initial image just yet. They were still considered a poor man's food, and in truth, that is what they were. Even in the late 1800s, It was really just sharecroppers and southern farmers that had these. It wasn't until the early 20th century that chitlins had become rooted the way I was talking about. They were still largely popular in just the South, but it was things like the chitlin circuit where legends like Aretha Franklin and B.B. Kings were known to perform and help turn them into a common food. I mean, the circuit was known for having chitlins on hand all the time. Despite that, they still were considered a low-class food mostly because of the way it would take hours to cook and clean it to remove the smell. That part really put a lot of people off of it. Recently, though, in the 2000s, a lot of soul food restaurants have tried to reinvent it and have started offering chitlins served in really premium ways, doubling down on the cultural attachment while bringing culinary finesse. Gnudi is an Italian dish that we take from Umbria, and they're actually pretty similar to gnocchi. Imagine if you made your gnocchi with ricotta cheese and starches instead of the typical stuff. Gnudi, funnily enough, actually means naked in Japanese, and it's a clever little joke too, since gnudi isn't made with any kind of pasta wrapping like your typical gnocchi is. So, one of the reasons this dish got really popular was because of how badly people wanted to show off their skill in the kitchen. The big thing here was nailing the burro noce, or the brown butter sauce, and shaping and poaching the gnudi. It took a lot of precise, detail-oriented skill to shape the gnudi, and that meant that you only made it if you were comfortable with your skill in the kitchen. Vegetable pot pie was proof that you didn't need meat to make a satisfying meal. When times were tough and the meat was either too pricey or just plain unavailable, families turned to the next best thing: vegetables. Awful alternative for all of us who hate veggies, but you had to do what you had to do just to get by. The humble pot pie, traditionally packed with chicken or beef, took a vegetable-only turn during the Great Depression. It consisted of hearty vegetables like potatoes, carrots, peas, and some onions. Vegetable pot pie was a filling, flavorful dish that still gave you that comforting feeling of a homemade meal. And nobody here can even imagine what that must have felt like. When all you ate were just scraps of whatever you could find, getting a vegetable pot pie must have felt like getting a roasted steak. Plus, it was a great way to use up whatever was in the garden or on sale at the market. No meat? No problem. Those veggies could stand their ground. Cooking a vegetable pot pie wasn't only about stretching the budget, it was also about creativity. You could throw in whatever comes to mind and call it dinner. If you, by some miraculous chance, got any canned tuna, that would go in there also. And let's be honest, upon cracking open that golden crust, it didn't matter what lay inside. It only mattered that you had food on the table. Beans and rice, a dynamic duo that has been filling up bellies for generations. In lean times, this combination was a nutritional powerhouse with protein, carbs, and plenty of flavor, all without costing much. When money was tight, beans and rice were the way to go. They were cheap, filling, and could stretch to feed a whole family with just a few basic ingredients. Lobster was something that was so abundant in New England during colonial America times that they would honestly just wash up on the shore. And I'm not really talking about a few lobsters, a little nice gang of them. I'm talking about a massive lobster pile. I mean, most people were tired of the damn thing. They had no idea how to spice it up or what else to do with it. That's how common lobster used to be. They were abundant, they were cheap, not special at all, and just the exact most extreme opposite you can imagine from where they are today. Hell, farmers used crushed lobster shells for fertilizer. That is the state we are talking about today. It also never got a chance to make a big, bright name for itself because lobster was always geographically locked to the coastal cities, so people who lived far away just didn't have it. That is until canning came around. Now, canning made lobster a lot more accessible, to the point it became a shelf stable. And then came railroads in the 1800s that meant that people were able to trade lobster with inland cities like New York. And of course, the rich saw a new toy, and this was one they could dress up all pretty and everything too. So, the best part about going to South Carolina is easily the frogmore stew that you can find in the low-country parts of the state. Despite what the name implies, rest assured, there aren't any toads or frogs that will jump out from your bowl of stew. It's just a small little reference to frogmore. This is a community that you can find in St. Helena Island, located in South Carolina. It's said that this is where the dish first came from, and it's a one-pot boil that's become pretty closely associated with Carolina cuisine. This seafood boil pretty much is made of all the basic ingredients you would imagine modern boils to use. You have your mashed potatoes, corn on the cob, shrimp, vegetables, and spices, and it really is one of those crowd-pleasing dishes I talked about earlier. It's nearly impossible to go wrong with this dish because it's got a lot of variety. If you're sitting with a group of people who aren't the biggest fans of shrimp, you can throw in some cod, some oysters, or crab. Whatever kind of seafood gets the current group going, it can work in frogmore stew. Since this is entirely a boil, it's also pretty nutritious. This is part of why the dish got so popular, since people living on the Carolina coast would rely on one-pot boils like these, which made use of the catch of the day. If you believe that eating insects is a modern sustainable practice, you are wrong. In the Dust Bowl, crispy fried grasshoppers were not a joke, they were a staple food. During the poor harvests, and when meat was hard to come by, farmers looked to the hordes of grasshoppers feeding on the crops. Talk about revenge dining. Hunting grasshoppers was a family event, and when you had gathered enough grasshoppers in a bucket, then the cooking process started. They were washed, marinated, and then fried to a crisp golden brown. The result? A crunchy snack that contained protein and was not too shabby if one didn't consider what they were consuming. Grasshoppers are in fact a form of superfood as they contain high protein, iron, and good fats. The Dust Bowl families were not consciously trying to innovate, but they were able to feed themselves in a way that many others could not. Also, if you fry anything, it automatically becomes at least 50% tastier, doesn't it? Nowadays, insects are being considered as a source of food, but in the past, crispy grasshoppers were a means of feeding oneself. Oatmeal went out the window and cornmeal came in, especially as the base of dishes like Johnny cakes, which were the cravings of everyone. They were made from fried cornmeal gruel, hot water, salt, or sweetened milk if it was available. People used a specific kind of pan to make these too, and it was known as a spider pan. Essential to the Johnny cake experience was keeping a very watchful eye on them to ensure the crisp did not burn, as well keeping a constant supply of bacon fat. That was another thing that got popular as people would store the fat from strips of bacon up and use it in dishes like this. In half an hour, you had a pretty decent lunch made with some pretty bare-bones ingredients. Yes, you heard it here first, skunk stew. Even when the Dust Bowl left dinner plates empty, people were not the only ones who could not escape being eaten. Not even skunks. Now, before you start gagging, let me explain. Skunks were not the preferred source of protein, but when the resources were scarce, the farmers made do with whatever they could hunt down. Cooking skunk stew was not for the faint-hearted. First, you had to, de-skunk the skunk. It was mandatory to have the scent glands removed unless one wanted the house cleared faster than a tornado. After washing, it was cooked with what vegetables and spices were available. The result? A rather soft and gamey meal that was palatable though, but not one that would make me eagerly look forward to the next meal. Skunks may sound like the butt of some jokes, but these animals were a good source of protein food when all else was scarce. And can you imagine? A skunk was not as smelly as other wild games like raccoon or possum? Talk about a backhanded compliment. While skunk stew appears to be the epitome of the challenge-accepted food that is popular today for the survivors of the Dust Bowl, it was a symbol of survival. They made desperation into dinner. As they say, where there is life, there is a chance to live, and sometimes to live, you have to eat the wild, literally. Comfort food in the 1940s could not be discussed without somebody bringing up American slumgullion. This was really hot in the Midwest and the South, mostly by its other name of goulash. The dish has been in recipes and cookbooks since at least 1913, and it would include ground beef simmered in a tomato sauce. It was a dish for nights that you really wanted to make matter, and it was also a great way to keep the nutrition and protein intake up. Think of it as like a kind of casserole, and if you have heard of it before, you should know the 1930s versions were a bit different. These ones involved no pasta or macaroni or cheese. Those would become staples of the dish much later on. And we have grandparents to thank for that too. A soldier in the trenches, weary from the day's march, taking a moment to relax with a mug of beer in hand and a hunk of cheese by their side. It might seem like a simple luxury, but for soldiers throughout history, beer and cheese were essential parts of their rations. Soldiers in ancient Rome and during the Napoleonic Wars were often issued daily beer rations. This wasn't just for comfort. Beer, with its high water content, was a safer alternative to potentially contaminated water. It was a source of hydration, calories, and a little morale boost. The beer often wasn't the craft brews we enjoy today, but a more basic, hearty brew that could be easily consumed in the field. Cheese, on the other hand, was a perfect companion. Its durability made it ideal for soldiers on the move. Hard cheeses like Parmesan or Gouda, which could withstand long journeys, were often paired with bread. The protein-rich cheese kept soldiers full, providing energy for long campaigns. While the pairing may seem basic, it was a strategic choice. Beer and cheese provided the nourishment soldiers needed. If these 80s meals took you back, comment the one you remember best, like the video, and subscribe so we don't lose the tastes that made us.